In 1492, the Queen of Spain funded Christopher Columbus to make a voyage to the New World in search of an all-water route to Asia across the Atlantic Ocean. However, Christopher Columbus landed on the Caribbean islands instead of Asia. This was the beginning of an era of colonization. Columbus's arrival marked the start of the global diffusion of trade of produce, livestock, people, and unfortunately, diseases. This was known as the Columbian Exchange and contributed to the massive change that placed Europe into the center of global markets. Diseases such as smallpox wiped out many of the natives during the days of early America. Slaves were also brought over during this exchange. In 1588, the colony of Roanoke was established in Virginia by Sir Walter Raleigh. However, without experience or proper governing, the colony failed by 1590 and became known as the Lost Colony, whose full story is still unknown. In 1607, Jamestown, Virginia was settled by the London Company of Great Britain. This was the first successful and permanent English settlement. The colony of Jamestown survived because of Captain John Smith and the Powhatan Indians. Short terms of peace would be pushed aside by conflict over land, but as disease continued to pervade the native population, their strength dwindled. A major source of conflict emerged when tobacco became the popular export of the colony. The tobacco would destroy the soil which it grew on, so the settlers continued to take land from the Indians in order to grow more tobacco. This cycle continued on and on. The increased demand of tobacco led to the development of plantation slavery. In 1619, the House of Burgesses was established, which resembled the first representative government in the colonies. In 1620, the Puritans left Anglican England for the New World in hopes of establishing religious freedom. The Puritans reached the New England area rather than their original destination of Virginia. When the Puritans finally settled in Plymouth, the settlers created the Mayflower Compact on board, which asserted that the power of the government comes from the people who are governed, not from God. Although the first winter was hard, the settlers later received help from the Indians, who taught them how to grow crops such as corn. In 1622, an uprising occurred, in which the Powhatans attempted to rid their land of the new colonists. This demonstrates the beginning of the growing tension between white settlers and the Native Americans. As colonization continued, Maryland was founded in 1634. This colony was intended to be a Catholic colony that supported religious tolerance. In 1636, Roger Williams, a Protestant, founded Rhode Island as a place for religious tolerance and the idea of separation of church and state. Anne Hutchinson believed that faith and God's grace are enough to place someone upon the elect. This challenged the Puritan beliefs, and therefore she was banned for heresy. Maryland was founded by Lord Baltimore as a haven for Catholics. William Penn and his fellow Quakers received the colony of Pennsylvania, which was tolerant of all religions. In the 18th century, Benjamin Franklin made many contributions to the development of the colonies. He invented things such as the lightning rod and the Franklin stove, and wrote Poor Richard's Almanac. In 1754, Franklin created the Albany Plan, which was an early attempt of having united colonies for the purpose of defense.
By the mid-1700s, the continent of North America was becoming a highly contested hotspot, one where three superpowers of the age were locked in a battle of colonization. The continent was a ticking time bomb. It was only a matter of time before conflict either originated in the colonies or spread from Europe. To put this in historical perspective, this situation resembles Europe on the eve of World War I, where each major power was in sharp competition with one another, with only a border separating them. The war eventually erupts here, in what is now Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, from a small skirmish between French troops and a small British force led by a young colonel, George Washington. The first segment of war saw a string of French victories, from the ambush of General Braddock to the Marquis de Montcalm's victory at Fort William Henry, although before long the British began to send reinforcements at a rate the French could not match. In addition, they began to evolve their fighting strategy. In the beginning of the war, British soldiers would fight in tactics adapted to the wide plains of Europe. They would move in regiment lines and in very disciplined, tight formations. These strategies were not suited well to the dense woods and rough terrain of the American colonies. By war's end, the British had begun to use their colonial militia and native allies to conduct guerrilla-styled, undisciplined warfare, the strategy the French had used all along. This new adaptation of fighting would serve the American patriots well when it came time to fight the British military. By 1763, the French had seen complete defeat in North America. Their last stronghold, Louisburg, had been completely destroyed by British guns, and they no longer had the financial means to keep fighting. The Peace Treaty of Paris, signed in 1763, officially ended war, and the French lost all of their North American possessions to Great Britain. The French and Indian War brought massive change into the colonies. Following the war, the British put an end to their policy of salutary neglect. seeing that in order to maintain the security and economic health of their North American possessions, they must become directly involved. In addition, the new taxation laws put in place to pay off British war debts saw that the Crown for the first time directly taxed the colonies, which would be a major source of discontent in years to come. With the French now ousted from the continent, there was seemingly no existing threat. The natives, who previously played off each side to their own benefit, as they did during the war, were now forced to either agree to British demands or fight. The colonists saw this result as the beginning of a new golden age of expansion. The French no longer blocked access beyond the Appalachian Mountains, so the colonists believed it was their right to be allowed to push west into the fertile Mississippi Valley. Although the Proclamation of 1763 wiped out those hopes, this British law blocked the American colonists from settling past the Appalachians, and in effect gave the British a monopoly over the Ohio River Valley. The British wanted to ease tensions with the natives by placing this land aside until further agreements could be made. The American colonists, however, saw this as a British mockery of American rights, as they not only restricted the land that they had fought and died for, they did so without the colonists' knowledge. The colonial reaction to the proclamation represents the first major divide between the Americans and their mother country. In the following period, these consequences will have the continued effect at pushing the colonists further towards revolution. The British Empire came out of the French and Indian War larger and more powerful, but also larger in debt. To finance the war, the British government had borrowed heavily from Dutch and English bankers, so much that they doubled their national debt by 1763. Seeing that their expenses had gone to the protection of the American colonies, they believed that the colonists, not the British subjects, should carry much of the debt. Beginning with the Revenue Act of 1762, which had tax collectors based in England, not the colonies, dispense taxes, the British began to collect their tax. Going against this new massive taxation strategy was the self-taxation mindset fostered under the age of salutary neglect. Before the French and Indian War, the British had in many ways left the colonies to themselves, allowing them to mostly self-govern. So when it came time to collect taxes, directly following the war, colonists were in strong protest. In addition, this act called for the crackdown on smugglers trading illegally, mainly to the French Indies. More and more duties were being placed on simple, everyday items. The Stamp and Currency Acts of 1764 stirred much resentment a year later in 1765. As the decade wore on, increased taxes and British decree continually sparked anger in the colonies. After such protests as the Boston Tea Party of 1773 and the Boston Massacre of 1777, the Crown passed the Intolerable Acts, condemning Boston to a military lockdown for its actions. In addition, this act expanded the territory of Quebec, effectively enlarging Catholic power in the region. These acts were seen as nothing short of tyranny from the Crown, and in 1774 the First Continental Congress issued the Declarations and Resolves, a document outlining the colony's rejection of the Intolerable Acts, a set of grievances, as well as a Bill of Rights. To this, King George V responded, "The die is now cast, the colonies must either submit or triumph." The following year, in 1776, the speeches of William Henry would echo in the fields of Lexington and Concord, as the first shots of the Revolution would sound. The start of the Revolution would mark some of the nation's highest and lowest moments. The start of the war saw mainly the major defeats of General Gates, as well as some small skirmishes throughout the colonies and frontier. Although the Battle of Saratoga in 1777 became a rallying point for the colonies, they still had many dark days ahead. Following the harsh winter at Valley Forge, the Continental Army, now newly trained under von Steuben in 1778, would rally new support and go on to clash head-to-head with the British Army at the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse. In the South, a pivotal battle was raging. General Lord Cornwallis in 1778 had begun a new strategy. It involved moving up from the South, where Loyalist support remained, and launching attacks on New York and Philadelphia. Although what stood in his way was General Nathanael Greene and his army of regulars and militia. After many close battles, including the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, Greene had pushed Cornwallis to a small Virginia town, Yorktown, where he surrendered and was soundly defeated. Cornwallis' surrender in 1780 marked the end for any British hope to quell the rebellion. 3 years later, in 1783, a treaty was signed in Paris, ending the war and recognizing the United States as a nation.
The conflict over the National Bank led to the formation of two political parties, the Federalists of Hamilton and the Republicans of Jefferson. The Federalists favored strong central government and supported implied powers, while the Republicans supported small government as well as strict interpretation of the Constitution. The election of 1797 elected John Adams as the Federalist president. However, the election led to Jefferson, a Republican, to become vice president. Under Adams' presidency, the XYZ affair stirred outrage against the French. Consequently, the quasi-war with France led Congress to create the Department of Navy. During 1798, the Alien and Sedition Acts were created, which widened the powers of Adams' administration. The result was that Republican leaders thought the Alien and Sedition Acts were unconstitutional and thus passed the Kentucky and Virginia Resolution, which allowed state bodies to nullify federal laws in the states. However, only 2 states adopted the resolution, and the issue died. However, this issue would be a factor towards the secession crisis. The election of 1800 resulted in the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. The Judiciary Act was passed in 1801 and resulted in Adams filling vacancies with party supporters. During President Jefferson's presidency, various important law cases took place. Marbury v. Madison established the power of judicial review. At home, the importation of slaves were outlawed in 1808. A major aspect of Jefferson's presidency was the Louisiana Purchase, which more than doubled the size of the United States. He then sent Lewis and Clark to explore the land. In 1809, Madison was elected as the Republican president. The Non-Intercourse Act, which opened trade to all nations except France and Britain, expired in 1810 and was replaced with Macon's Bill No. 2, which gave the president the power to prohibit trade that violated America's neutrality within the wars in Europe. The War of 1812 began and was the result of British imprisonment of U.S. sailors, interference in American trade, as well as the British support for the natives. The war was ended with the Treaty of Ghent, which was signed on Christmas Eve of 1814. The Hartford Convention of 1814 ended the Federalist Party's political power when the War of 1812 ended because they opposed the war effort. Monroe was elected president in 1817 with only 1 electoral vote opposed, a symbol of national unity. The years after the War of 1812 led to a boom in foreign demand of American cotton, grain, and tobacco. The Second National Bank caused inflation through liberal credit policies. This resulted in the Depression of 1819, which affected the West. During this time, the Marshall Court established major law precedents. Fletcher v. Peck showed that the state law is inferior to U.S. national law. Dartmouth College v. Woodward limited the power of state governments to control corporations. Gibbons v. Ogden showed that only Congress had the right to regulate commerce among states. And Marbury v. Madison established the Supreme Court's power of judicial review. Statehood was an issue as the United States expanded outwards. The Missouri Compromise was when the Missouri Territory organized and applied for statehood, but many southern states were for slavery. A deadlock was immediate, as the Senate could not decide. Henry Clay came up with a compromise solution that would make Maine a free state and Missouri a slave state. Also, the provision prohibited slavery in the remainder of the Louisiana Territory, north of the southern border of Missouri. This passed through Congress and is a symbol of the division in the South and the North. This time also led to the growth of public education and higher education. The Second Great Awakening led to a revival in religious fervor as an emphasis on personal salvation. God's grace and an individualistic approach became popular. In 1824, Adams became president with Henry Clay as the Secretary of State. This was known as the corrupt bargain. In 1828, Adams faced John Calhoun and the nullification after Congress passed a new tariff bill which called for higher import duties for goods brought by Southern planters. In 1828, Jackson was elected as president because of his appearance as the common man and a self-made Westerner. Jackson used the spoils system, which hired untrained common people to perform the job. He replaced government employees with his supporters. Jackson's Indian policies involved the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which moved the Cherokee Nation from northern Georgia to the west. This mass exodus is called the Trail of Tears, which resulted in the death of a quarter of the natives. The second nullification crisis began in 1832 with the Tariff of Abominations. Jackson passed a force bill from Congress which allowed him to use federal troops to force the collection of taxes. Jackson also destroyed the National Bank and removed federal deposits from the bank and distributed it to the state and local banks. This resulted in the Panic of 1837. The Panic of 1837 led to the Specie Circular, which required payment in hard money, which hurt all Americans. The election of 1836 resulted in the election of Martin Van Buren of New York. Van Buren inherited the problems and resentments caused by the Jackson era. The chaos left from the National Bank led to the creation of the Independent Treasury. After the Compromise of 1850, with California becoming part of U.S. territory, along with the territory obtained from the Gadsden Purchase, the issue of slavery was still being debated over. The Kansas-Nebraska Act repealed the Missouri Compromise made in 1820 because it allowed the people in the territories to determine whether or not slavery would be allowed, a concept known as popular sovereignty. The Kansas-Nebraska Act would eventually lead to Bleeding Kansas. In 1856, Buchanan won the election. During his presidency, therefore, they could not be taken away from their owners according to the Fifth Amendment. As time progressed, the sectionalism became more and more apparent. The Lincoln-Douglas debates took place in 1858 during the campaign for a seat in the Illinois Senate. In 1859, the raid at Harper's Ferry occurred. Lincoln came into presidency in 1860, along with the creation of the Confederacy. The Civil War began at Fort Sumner in 1861. The war was fought over the idea of the western expansion of slavery. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which would free all slaves that lived in states that were still in rebellion. Eventually, the 13th Amendment was passed, which prohibited slavery. Lincoln was assassinated less than a week after the Confederacy surrendered. Following the Civil War was a time period known as Reconstruction. The states that seceded were readmitted into the Union. However, sectionalism still existed. The North and the South were still very different socially and economically, and blacks did not yet find the equality they had hoped for. In fact, it was during this time that new black codes were established. Ultimately, Reconstruction failed and hostility increased. The Gilded Age followed the Civil War. This term was coined by Mark Twain, who described this period as being one that appeared nicely on the outside, but was actually very corrupt on the inside. The Gilded Age consisted of political machines, bosses, and scandals. The Gilded Age was also a time of great technological advancements. Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, which allowed for the extension of the workday. The economy grew tremendously during the last quarter of the 19th century. Captains of industry, or robber barons as some may say, rose to power and gained extreme wealth. Assembly lines were formed with the help of the creation of interchangeable parts. Assembly lines made mass production possible. The government was very pro-business during this time period, so consolidation and monopolies developed. John D. Rockefeller practiced horizontal integration, while Andrew Carnegie practiced vertical integration. Carnegie also believed in the theory of social Darwinism, which meant that only the fittest would survive. Carnegie also stood by the gospel of wealth, which said that the wealthy were responsible for the welfare of the less fortunate as well. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was passed to forbid combinations and conspiracies in the restraint of trade. In 1877, the Supreme Court ruled in Munn v. Illinois that states had the power to regulate private industry that served the public interest. This decision was then overturned in the Wabash case when it ruled that states could not establish rates involving interstate commerce. The Interstate Commerce Act regulated unfair practices. The Pendleton Act created the Civil Service Commission to oversee the processes for hiring government employees. This was passed as part of the civil service reform. As production increased, there was an increase in the demand for laborers. Manufacturers hired women, children, and immigrants as a cheap source of labor. Cities were unsanitary, full of crime, and lacking housing. As transportation methods improved, those who were better off could move to nicer neighborhoods outside of the poverty-stricken cities. However, the poor were not fighting the battles alone. Political bosses such as Boss Tweed would help the poor in exchange for their votes. Those who sought change formed labor unions. The Knights of Labor was one of the first national labor unions and included both skilled and unskilled workers from different crafts. The Knights of Labor fought for goals such as shorter workdays, equal pay for men and women, and child labor laws. Another labor union, the American Federation of Labor, only consisted of skilled workers who avoided larger political questions and focused on bread and butter issues. In the city, settlement houses were founded as efforts of reform. One of the most common founders was Jane Addams with a Hull House in Chicago. Although the poor suffered through a lot, those who were well off enjoyed more free time for recreational activities such as sports, theater, and vaudeville. The public also started reading newspapers and magazines, and a new style of reporting became known as yellow journalism. Organizations such as the National American Woman Suffrage Association that defended women's rights were also created by reform leaders such as Elizabeth Stanton. In 1896, the court ruled in Plessy v. Ferguson that separate but equal segregation was constitutional. Because of this, blacks were faced with Jim Crow laws and suffered from systems that put them in debt, such as sharecropping and the crop lien system. Booker T. Washington was a leader who believed that blacks should advance economically before earning complete equal rights. W.E.B. Du Bois wanted immediate equality. During this time, railroads continued expanding westward, and the West was announced as settled and the frontier was closed. Frederick Turner created the Turner Thesis, which declared that the frontier defined the American spirit and it fostered democracy. In the Great Plains, the Homestead Act and the Morrill Land Grant Act were passed, which helped to settle the West. One problem, however, was that the Indians were still in the West. Helen Hunt Jackson's A Century of Dishonor was about the injustices towards Native Americans. This sparked a push for change, starting with the Dawes Severalty Act. This act broke up the reservations and distributed land among Native American families, and eventually granted American citizenship. During this time, the farmers of the Great Plains and the Midwest faced many hardships. The oppressive shipping rates, along with the issue of the silver/gold standard, affect farmers in a destructive way. The free silver movement was supported by William Jennings, who argued that a silver standard would help the country. Farmers wanted free silver because many farmers were struggling. Bimetallism would cause inflation in silver, which would help the farmers. However, the gold standard remained. As a result, many farmers faced foreclosures and hard times. However, a solution to the hardships was developing. The Granger movement came first in 1867, which allowed farmers to buy machinery, sell crops, and perform duties together. The Grangers had political powers, but was replaced by the Farmers' Alliance. The Farmers' Alliance was successful enough to form its own political party, the People's Party. The Spanish-American War began in 1898 after USS Maine was blown up in Havana Harbor in Cuba. Fighting off the Spanish, the U.S. defeated the Spanish at Manila and then invaded the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. The war ended with the Treaty of Paris. As a result of the Spanish-American War, Cuba was liberated as an independent country, and the U.S. obtained Puerto Rico and Guam and the Philippines for $20 million. The U.S. had a tough time deciding if the U.S. should annex the Philippines. The U.S. felt like it had an obligation to Christianize and civilize the Filipinos. This was known as the white man's burden. In the end, the U.S. decided to annex the Philippines, but the Filipino resisted by waging a guerrilla war. The U.S. eventually gained control of the Philippines, but later granted them independence in 1946. Continuing to practice imperialism, McKinley was looking to enter into the markets of Asia. McKinley enacted the Open Door policy, which said that all nations, including those in the Western Hemisphere, should have equal access to China's markets. European nations were not happy with this policy, since they had to fight to gain these markets, so they wanted to keep them as well.
The period of 1900 to 1920 was a time of great tension and uneasiness both on the world stage and in America. Politically, the Progressive Era policies still existed but were soon coming to an end as the Progressive Party dissolved after the election of 1912. Following this, the Republicans made gains in Congress and state governments. Politically, policies were aimed to create a stable economy. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 was created for stability in the banking industry and the overall economy. The law divided the nation into 12 regions with a Federal Reserve Bank in each region. In 1914, the Clayton Antitrust Act was enacted, which was a harsher version of the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Its effects included continuing the trend of attacking trusts along with outlawing interlocking directorates and price discrimination. The early 1900s marked a new epoch in both women's and African American rights movements. The presidents of that era, especially Wilson, gained a reputation for being apathetic towards the civil rights movement. Even so, women's suffrage began to increase in momentum during Wilson's presidency. Led by the National American Woman Suffrage Association, several states granted rights to vote for women. Eventually, the 19th Amendment, passed in 1920, granted all women the right to vote. As for African Americans, groups such as the NAACP were formed in order to continue the fight for racial justice. Immigration was also a major issue during this era. Wilson's policies were usually favorable towards immigrants, as immigrants from Eastern Europe, including Germany, Italy, and the Baltic states, flooded the nation. However, xenophobic attitudes existed during the time along with quotas. World War I was casting its shadow after the first decade of the 1900s. Roosevelt's foreign policy was isolationist at the time. Many Americans wanted the U.S. to stay out of the war. In the Caribbean, Congress approved the plan to build the Panama Canal. The United States was widely present in Latin America because Roosevelt claimed that instability in the region constituted a threat to American security. This idea became known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, aka the Big Stick Policy. In 1914, World War I broke out in Europe and Wilson issued American neutrality. However, the U.S. drifted towards the Allies and sent much-needed trade to them. This included munitions, food, and raw materials. The catalyst for U.S. entry into World War I was the unrestricted submarine warfare that was perpetrated by the German naval strategy. The submarine crisis of 1915 was a major point in this conflict. The Germans used their advanced submarines to create an unrestricted naval blockade of the British Isles, meaning any ship attempting to go near would be targeted. The Sussex Pledge was when Germany promised to stop submarine warfare if the British did not stop with violations of international law. The Zimmermann telegram was a major catalyst for America's entry into the war. The British intercepted secret messages from the Germans about a plan that said if Mexico would ally with Germany in a war against the United States, they would receive the territories lost during the Mexican-American War. In 1917, the United States declared war on Germany, although unprepared and without sufficient military. The Selective Service Act was passed on May 18, 1917. Women and blacks were kept in segregated units. To finance and fight the war, the United States implemented a number of measures to control every aspect of American industry. The War Industries Board was created for controlling raw material, production, prices, and labor relations. To ration food, Herbert Hoover headed the Food Commission, doing such things as fixing high process, and creating programs such as Wheatless Mondays and Meatless Tuesdays. Fuel was conserved through the Fuelless Mondays and a coupon system to ration gas. As public opinion was essential to fighting a foreign war, the Wilson administration created the Commission on Public Information to censor anti-war sentiment and propagandize. To further support the war at home, the Espionage and Sedition Acts provided fines and imprisonment to those who spoke out against the war and posed a threat to the war effort. The act was upheld in Schneck v. the U.S. by claiming that in times of clear and present danger, such acts were constitutional. The war ended on 11 November 1918 after 4 years. The United States became involved in the war for hopes of having a say in the peacemaking process. The U.S. hoped that this would give it a more prominent voice on the world stage. Wilson then proposed his 14 points, which included creation of the League of Nations, no secret treaties, free trade, and others. However, it failed to pass in the Senate. Wilson's defeat was blamed for his wartime civil liberty abuses, the League of Nations, and various strikes and inflation after the war. The 1920s led to the growth of the economy. However, various facets of the economy did not share the nation's wealth. Agriculture suffered because of improved technologies and new farming methods. The automobile was the driving force of the economy. The automobile led to new industries such as glass, rubber, steel, along with paved roads, highways, and gasoline industries. Credit was important because it allowed
Action.
to expand greatly as people spent more. As a result, this led to a crash. Big business prospered post-war because of the lax government policies of World War I and before. Banking and finance grew as people invested in real estate, stocks, and bonds. Labor unions were weaker as companies now had pension and insurance, stock options, and social and sporting events. Labor membership dropped almost 20% in some places. Farmers were hit hard because of the new machinery and new expenses. The standard of living grew along with urbanization. Many houses received telephones, natural gas, electricity, and piped water. During this time, many cultural values were evolving. The sexual revolution was when traditional American values were shifting. Sexual freedom and premarital sex were less taboo and sometimes became the norm. Many social issues became liberal, but women now worked in the job force as standard female occupations, such as nursing. However, they received lower pay than men. Blacks were still oppressed but lived better in cities. They held low-paying jobs but were confined to specific areas of the city. Du Bois called for integration and equal rights. Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association advocated black pride and separatism to go back to Africa. Mexicans also migrated to cities such as Los Angeles, San Antonio, and Denver. They held low-paying jobs and lived in barrios, which were poor neighborhoods. They did much domestic and unskilled work. Education expanded to most children, and vocational education funded by the Smith-Hughes Act provided funding for technical studies. Religion increased and fundamentalists and creationism were popular. The Scopes trial was a major trial during this case. Emergence of pop culture was apparent. Movies such as The Jazz Singer and New Stars led to entertainment. On Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed and people lost their life savings. As a result, the nation was plunged into the Great Depression, a depression that would last until the start of World War II. Hoover's laissez-faire beliefs led to worsening depression. However, he did put much effort into trying to stop the depression. Volunteerism and public works were popular, but Hoover believed that the government should not get involved with charity. This, of course, created much tension. The Bonus Army marched to Washington, D.C. to protest the lack of payment for World War I veterans. The election of 1932 led to Roosevelt being elected. He tried new programs called the New Deal. He also relied on Keynesian economics, which proposed that the government would use deficit spending to fuel government programs. He repealed prohibition in his term, including AAA, TVA, and other government programs. People had more supportive views of the government. The 1930s had various new developments. Literature became popular, and writers such as Hemingway, Lewis, and Tolkien were popular. Also, the WPA constructed playgrounds, playing fields, and public buildings with arts.
The radio was popular and entertained many through music and news. The Good Neighbor policy allowed better relationships with Latin America. The U.S. did not intervene in the Cuban Revolution, and the U.S. passed the Platt Amendment. As World War II draws near, the U.S. declares neutrality but continues to loan weapons to the Allies. The United States mobilizes for war, and Pearl Harbor occurs. Americans help with the war in Europe, as well as fighting in the Pacific. Douglas MacArthur uses a strategy of island hopping to slowly reduce the forces of the enemy. The U.S. government established the Manhattan Project, which was a top-secret weapon development program. The result of this program was the creation of the atomic bomb, which was dropped on Japan at the end of the war. The war also increased xenophobia, especially towards the Japanese Americans. After Pearl Harbor, war relocation camps, or Japanese internment camps, were set up to contain almost 10,000 Japanese. During war, Americans practiced living the way they did during World War I by conserving supplies. Bonds and victory gardens were popular at home. Food, metal, and gasoline were especially limited, and people were encouraged to save for the war effort. Now that the war ended, the post-war effort began. The goal was not to repeat the same mistakes of World War I. Conferences during this time included the Yalta Conference, which set plans for the UN as well as post-war Europe, the conferences to determine peace, and the Potsdam Conference, which covered the plans for Germany as well as unconditional surrender of Japan. After World War II, the Cold War begins, which resulted from the disagreements between the USSR and the United States over the ideals of democracy and communism. Major events included the communist overthrow of Cuba, the Berlin War, the Berlin aircraft, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. During this time, the civil rights movement began as African Americans wanted equal political, economical, and social rights. This included the Montgomery bus boycott, as well as other peaceful forms of protest. Everything culminated to the Million-Man March on Washington, led by Martin Luther King. This resulted in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed by Johnson. Johnson also passed Medicare, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the Immigration Act of 1965, disabled quotas, and funded the space race. Many other wars were fought because of the Cold War. These were known as proxy wars. They included Vietnam, Korea, and Afghanistan. Another battlefield was the space race, which also helped with technology and weaponry. The U.S. won the space race in 1969 when man landed on the moon. Vietnam counterculture included protests, especially among young people. Various protests occurred at universities around the country. The most famous are the Berkeley riots and the Kent State Massacre. The Berkeley riots involved students in a group free speech movement which espoused freedom of speech and academic integrity. The protests involved thousands of students, with several dozen arrested. The Kent State Massacre took place at Kent State University in Ohio on May 4, 1970. The protest resulted from the news of the My Lai Massacre, in which American soldiers killed innocent civilians. A protest of about 400 students formed, and tension between the Ohio National Guard and the students grew. Suddenly, shots were fired and 4 students were killed, with several injured. This sparked outrage against the war. The second wave of the women's rights movement began with Betty Friedan's nonfiction book, Feminine Mystique, which argued that middle-class society limited women. This was a pivotal point in women's history, as it led to another epoch in women's rights movements. Women marched for equal pay as well as equality from a social viewpoint. World War II was a cause of this, as women worked the jobs that men had often had in the factory. It led to an attack on the cult of domesticity. The Vietnam War was soon hated by the people. Many Americans wanted the war to end due to moral and economic problems. For example, the war cost billions of dollars with thousands of deaths. The war also expanded the president's powers due to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Nixon was elected and expanded Vietnam into Cambodia despite American objections to the war. Human rights were violated as innocent civilians were killed. For example, the protests of the My Lai massacre occurred when innocent villagers were brutally murdered. Papers from the Pentagon were released showing how the U.S. government misled our country as well as Congress. Nixon's foreign policy was good with regards to China and Russia. He was the first president to visit China and improve relations. He also signed SALT, which limited the amount of missiles. The OPEC protested U.S. support of Israel and set an oil embargo on the United States and caused an oil crisis. The Watergate scandal ruins Nixon as Nixon's cronies were caught wiretapping the Democrats at Watergate Hotel. This made the people trust the government even less.
From 1980 to the present, America has gone through an influence change that affect the whole world. On January 2nd, 1980, President Carter announced that the U.S. athletes will not attend the Summer Olympics in Moscow, and that an embargo will take place on the Soviet Union unless they withdraw from Afghanistan. On February 13th of the same year, the opening ceremonies of the 1980 Winter Olympics are held in Lake Placid, New York. One of the most thrilling moments include the Miracle on Ice, when the U.S. amateur hockey team defeated the vaunted Soviet Union professional all-star team in the semifinal game. They won the gold medal over Finland later in the tournament. The census also indicated that the population of the United States had an 11.4 increase since 1970. On January 20th, 1981, Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as the 40th President of the United States of America. The U.S. hostages were released from being held captive in Iran after 444 days on the same day. President Reagan was shot in the chest by John Hinckley, Jr. on March 30th. Later in that year, on September 25th, the first woman was sworn in as a Supreme Court Justice, Sandra Day O'Connor. The next year, the Senate passed a bill that virtually eliminated the practice of busing to achieve racial integration. Also, there was the highest unemployment rate since 1940 and was recorded at 10.4%. By the end of November, over 11 million people would be unemployed. On June 30th, the deadline for the ratification of Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution passes without the necessary votes. On November 13th, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was dedicated in Washington, D.C., holding the names of more than 58,000 killed or missing during action. On April 20th of 1983, President Reagan signed the legislation meant to rescue the Social Security system from bankruptcy. Later, on June 18th, the first American woman entered space. Astronaut Sally Ride flew through the atmosphere and made history in the Space Shuttle Challenger. Also during this time, the initial proposal to develop technology to intercept incoming missiles, the Strategic Defensive Initiative Program, or Star Wars, was made by President Ronald Reagan. On May 12, 1984, the Louisiana World Exposition opens along the Mississippi River waterfront in New Orleans. The event, the world's last fair held in the United States, was plagued with financial trouble and drew significantly fewer visitors than predicted over 6 months, 7.3 million, although it was regarded as a catalyst in the recovery of the waterfront and warehouse district to public use. In November, President Ronald Reagan won his re-election campaign over Democratic challenger Walter F. Mondale, increasing his electoral college victory since his 1980 election to a margin of 525 to 13. 1985 began with the second inauguration of President Ronald Reagan. Later that year, on November 19th, the first meeting in 6 years between the leaders of the Soviet Union and the United States occurred when Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan engaged in a 5-hour summit conference in Geneva, Switzerland. This was a giant leap forward.
The election of 1988 allowed George H.W. Bush to become president. He was faced with a huge budget deficit of $143 billion. As a result, Congress increased taxes of gasoline, tobacco, and alcohol, and established an excise tax on luxury items, as well as cutting social programs. Unemployment began to rise, and inflation became worse. Other domestic issues included the Exxon Valdez accident that spilled millions of gallons of oil into Alaska's Prince William Sound. Also, the Clean Air Act was passed in October 1990, which mandated that the level of emissions was reduced by 50% by 2000. Communism collapsed in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. This marked the end of the Cold War. However, the Persian Gulf crisis began, and that led to the Persian Gulf War. In 1991, after the Gulf War, the United States set out post-war goals for the Middle East. This included arms control and international aid for reconstruction. In the election of 1992, Clinton was elected as the president. Clinton signed the North American Free Trade Agreement, which lifted trade barriers between Canada, U.S., and Mexico. Clinton was re-elected in 1996 and served as president during a time of great economic growth. E-businesses such as Apple and Microsoft grew as stock prices went really high. Soon, the stock market crashed and the economy was uncertain. In 2000 and 2004, George Bush was elected president. On September 11, 2001, terrorists crashed airliners into the Twin Towers, causing the death of thousands and also increased security all over America.